This is the PRA seminar series, the first one of 2020. I would like to introduce Dr. Amy Murray, who is currently working as a full-time research assistant on the CADA programme based within the Centre for Innovative Ageing at Swansea University. Up until recently, Amy has worked as a lecturer for the Social Sciences and Social Policy degree programmes within the university, and Amy has recently completed her PhD in social gerontology, which focuses specifically upon exploring the process of driving cessation in later life amongst current and retired older drivers and members of informal support networks. Prior to completing her PhD, Amy worked for the Department for Work and Pensions as both a state pension and a bereavement advisor, alongside studying her undergraduate degree in social policy and postgraduate degree in ageing studies at Swansea University. Amy also worked for voluntary organisations including the Royal Voluntary Service and the Stroke Association, gaining hands-on experience of working with a range of older adults with a variety of support needs. This voluntary work has most recently shifted to providing informal support to 2 older adults living in her local community who are living with dementia. Throughout her PhD, Amy has also undertaken work for the Wellbeing of Older People in Wales project, the Campaign to End Loneliness, and the International Longevity Centre UK. This work has largely entailed writing evidence-based literature reviews and analysing and reporting upon ageing research. Today's presentation by Dr. Murray will focus on the driving cessation in later life experiences of informal support network members. Thank you, Amy. Please start when you're ready.
Okay, so thank you everybody for taking the time to view my presentation today. As Hannah has just kindly outlined, what I'll be talking about today will be part of my PhD research, which I have recently completed. So because the PhD research was a 4-year project, I'm only going to provide you with a snapshot of part of that research process for the purpose of today's presentation. And for today's presentation, I will be drawing upon the experiences of informal support network members of older adults who are going through that process of giving up driving in later life. I'll talk more about the groups in my study as I move through the slides. So for the purpose of today's presentation, I wanted to briefly provide you with an outline of today's talk. So what I want to do first of all is provide a bit of background information about myself and talk about what my personal and professional inspirations were for embarking on that PhD process. I'll then outline a very brief research background to the project. So where did I get my research aim from and why is that research aim important relating to the field of literature within driving cessation. I'd like to then run you through the methodological approach that I employed to undertake the research. So where did I find my research participants and what specific methods did I employ to gather the data that I needed? Probably I'll spend the most time on the findings of my study. Like I said, I'll only be relating findings to some of the experiences of the informal support network members who I interviewed, because I don't have the time today to talk about the older adults' experiences as well. That could potentially be another session. And then I'll start to finish up then by summarising the key messages from my study, what the implications are for policy and practice, and some questions at the end from Hannah as well. Okay, so just to personalise this story really and talk a little bit about myself, I wanted to give an overview of what my personal and professional background is. So what led me to undertaking a PhD in ageing studies or social gerontology, and why did I focus on giving up driving in later life? So as you can see on the screen in front of you there are 2 images. So the first image on the left is a photograph of myself as a 2-year-old with my grandmother, or my nan as I called her, Margaret, and that was on holidays in Spain when I was around, as I said, 2 years old. The photo on the right then was about 25 years on, and that was taken a few years ago, and that also shows myself and my grandmother. The reason why I've presented both images is because they really do depict what I experienced with my grandmother in terms of role reversal. So the photo on the left, that was a period where my grandmother was looking after me, and she was caring for me, making sure that I was safe and happy. And then if you look at the photo in the right, the roles did completely reverse in the later part of her life. So I was her main informal support provider. So I was responsible for many of her health and social care needs. Some of those things did involve taking her to hospital appointments or taking her for a day out, taking her for coffee, etc. So I've got direct experience from that kind of grandparent relationship in relation to ageing and what ageing means from the perspective of a family member then. Now, as well as having a very close relationship and hands-on personal experience with all 4 of my grandparents, I also undertook a kind of professional development related to ageing. So whilst I was undertaking my A-levels, I worked for the Department for Work and Pensions, as Hannah's already said, as a state pension advisor, and I would be speaking to people there on a daily basis about the retirement transition in later life. So how were people who were reaching retirement age feeling about giving up work? As well as working there, I began a social policy degree at Swansea University, and I went on from there to study a master's specifically in gerontology or ageing studies. So along with the voluntary positions that Hannah's already talked about, I used the kind of personal and professional experiences that I'd gained, and that kind of put me in good stead then to apply for the PhD, which was looking at the process of giving up driving in later life. So I was interested in how people and how family members and networks of older people actually experience this later life transition. Did it have any links or any similarities or any differences with retirement, for example? So that is just what my link is, and it just explains a bit about the context of where this study was undertaken in. So I just need to outline then the research background in terms of what does the research picture say about giving up driving in later life. So the way that I found this information was through undertaking an extensive literature review before actually gathering primary data or primary research for my study. So through the literature search, I was able to identify that giving up driving in later life is a major later life transition, and outcomes of this transition are unfortunately primarily negative. So older people often experience feelings of depression, loneliness, isolation, and reduced out-of-home activities. In order to compensate for the loss of driving in later life, many older adults often rely upon their informal support networks. So this refers to aspects such as receiving lifts from their family and friends, or perhaps their family and friends running errands for them in order for them to meet their mobility and transport needs. Even though informal support is identified as a crucial factor in that process of giving up driving, there is very limited research available which has specifically looked at that aspect of informal support. Most of the research just identifies informal support as part of the process, but there is nothing really which specifically looks at that as an individual substitute to giving up driving. So a study in 2001, so that's going back almost 20 years ago, that stated Ralston et al., that a more in-depth understanding of informal support is required. So based on that quote alone and the knowledge background that I had that not much research had been undertaken in that area, I was able to formulate the primary research aim for my study. So I was really interested in exploring this process of giving up driving from the perspective of both current and retired older drivers, as well as members of their informal support networks. So I was really interested in, what does this informal support look like? Why is it important? Why do older people substitute driving with that alone? Why isn't the bus, for example, their preferred mode of transport? And I was also interested in the perspective of the providers of informal support. So if this is something that older people are going to be increasingly relying upon, we need to understand how the people providing the support experience this transition as well. So the reason why I've highlighted informal support network members there in red is because that is the main focus of today's talk. I am focusing on the experiences of the family, friends and community members of older people for the purpose of today's presentation alone. So to give some background in terms of how I undertook this research, to explain the methodological approach I employed. So this research was undertaken in South Wales, and how I started to recruit these individuals was through an informal word of mouth approach. I considered at the outset of the study putting poster advertisements or online social media advertisements for participants to come forward. However, when I was reading the literature, I was aware, as I've already outlined, that older people often experience isolation once they've given up driving. So it was from that perspective that I realised many older people who are no longer able to drive may not have the means to actually get to community-based services such as GP surgeries or dentists or even supermarkets in the local areas. And also in terms of the social media route, a lot of older people, based on the research that I have read, are still not comfortable with using that type of media. So to try and address that and to try and address the potential dropout rate that I would have experienced through that method, I thought the informal word of mouth approach was the most appropriate. So I began talking widely about my research to my own personal network. So speaking to members of my own family, speaking to friends and also work colleagues about the study. Through doing that, I was able to identify an older current driver in the local area and also a retired older driver in the local area. Once I'd undertaken the initial interviews with both of these older adults, I then employed the snowball strategy. So I asked each participant, were they aware of any older adult in the local area who was currently driving or who had given up driving? And I was successful in recruiting 15 older people through that word of mouth snowballing approach. And in terms of recruiting the informal support network of older people, I also employed a snowball strategy for that part of the recruitment process. So during the interviews with older people, I would ask them about their informal support networks. Could you tell me, do you have any children, for example? Are you married? Do you have any siblings? And I asked them if they did have an informal network, because it's important to mention not everybody in my study did. But for the people that did have that informal network, I asked them who they thought potentially could help them or currently does help them if they have given up driving, or who could help them if they were currently driving. And older adults then were able to refer me to either one informal support network member or some participants, as you can see on the screen to the right of that diagram, some participants were able to refer me to 4 informal support network members. So all in all, I had 30 participants. It was quite equal and it panned out that way. So older adults, there were 15 participants and 15 members of their informal support networks. These individuals ranged from spouses, siblings, adult children, neighbours, community members. So there was a pub landlord in my study, as well as nieces and nephews as well. So once I had successfully recruited everybody for the study, I needed to obviously collect the data in the most appropriate way. Now, because I was looking at individual lived experiences, the most successful and the most straightforward way to gather this information was through individual semi-structured interviews. So I primarily undertook these interviews in participants' homes, but I also undertook them in coffee shops and in pubs as well. So the location of the interviews were very much chosen by the participants. So I would actually go to them at a place that was convenient for them. Many network members would meet me during the week once they'd finished work. So a lot of them would meet me in coffee shops as well. Interviews took any time between 45 minutes to 2.5 hours. And in order to analyse the data, once I had transcribed all of these interviews, I employed Braun and Clark's strategy of a thematic analysis. So I was going through transcripts, identifying codes and themes, and that is where I was able to identify my overall findings from. Okay, so the findings that I'm going to present today, as I've already said, only refer to the experiences of informal support network members. And when they were talking about their lived experiences of being a network member of an older adult whilst they were going through that process of giving up driving, there were two main areas that became apparent through that analysis process. Firstly, network members talked about a number of consideration factors that they held accountable when determining whether or not they provided informal support to older people. And they also talked about specific outcomes from their own perspectives of the driving cessation process. So to explain these findings in a bit more depth, I wanted to provide some context, some real quotes from my study. Now, obviously, I've changed these names to pseudonyms to protect the identity of my participants. So these names aren't actually the real names, but these quotes are what participants told me. So when we were talking, myself and the network members, about informal support and the process of giving up driving, one of the first themes that became apparent that people talked about was the older adult's specific circumstances and characteristics. So these circumstances and characteristics often acted as a motivator for family, friends or neighbours to actually provide support. So if you look at the top left quote there by Abigail, that was a daughter of a retired older driver. She stated her mum has trouble walking. She's got really bad arthritis in her knees, which prevents her from walking. So Abigail actually took her to most places when she was no longer able to drive. So she was specifically there referring to the older person's health and mobility status. That was a motivator then, as I've already said, for providing support. However, older people's specific circumstances and characteristics could also act as a demotivator amongst network members when it came to providing support. So if you have a look there at the kind of top right speech mark on the quotation from Lynette, this referred to the niece of a retired older driver. And when talking about her experiences of helping her older aunt, Lynette stated, she's become so negative and bitter since she gave up driving, like she's blaming the world. And she's always moaning she hasn't seen anyone, even when I do my best to call in and do things for her. She never says thank you. So I've stopped doing so much for her now. So what Lynette was explaining to myself was that her aunt was very unappreciative of the support she was providing, and she felt undervalued and disrespected, and she felt that however much support she was providing, it was never quite good enough. So that was a demotivator, and as the participant states there, she actually reduced the amount of support that she was providing to her aunt after driving cessation. There are other quotes on there. I won't go through everything today in terms of every individual speech bracket there because of the time constraints that we have. I don't want it to go on too long, but I'll leave it up there for anybody to follow up in your own time. So remaining with that theme of consideration factors, network members, when talking about that decision-making context about providing support, they also talked about their individual attributes and factors that they considered. So Christine, their top right speech bubble, she was the best friend of a current older driver who was gradually starting to give up driving due to declining eyesight. So Christine stated it wouldn't be a problem at all providing her friend with support. She said, "I don't go to work anymore. I'm retired years ago." So it's not as if I wouldn't have the time to do it for her. So Christine was basically saying that because she was retired, and more background information, she also had never married or had children of her own. She said that providing support to her best friend if driving cessation occurred wouldn't be something that would be a problem to her. She would have the time and the availability to be able to do it. However, if we try and reverse that, so the flip side of Christine's experience, the daughter of a retired female driver, Harriet, presented a complete opposite account of her own specific attributes and factors, which actually acted as it was a motivator for providing support because her mum had a lot of support needs after giving up driving, but she actually stated that she found it really difficult. So Harriet said, "My partner has a little girl and she lives with us. I do most of the things around the house, the cleaning, cooking, you name it. I work full time as well. I know mum can't help it, but she needs a lot of support now and it's really hard." So she was really talking about that experience of role strain, and she was burnt out really in terms of her emotions. She was saying how she was exhausted all the time. So that was a complete other side of the coin than when we compare that to Christine's experience. The final area of consideration factors drawn upon by network members in this study related to relational or relationship factors. So it referred to joint factors between themselves as the network member and for the older person. So if we look at Anita's quote, the top left, that was a neighbour of a retired older driver, and she talked about knowing her neighbour for 19 years. She said, "Since I've lived here, Alice has always been the same. She's always been in the garden, throwing parties